In 1930, a 61-year-old man began walking toward the Arabian Sea. He was not leading an army. He carried no weapon, held no office, and commanded no territory. For 24 days, Mohandas Gandhi crossed western India on foot, traveling roughly 240 miles from his ashram to the coastal village of Dandi. By the time he reached the shore, thousands were moving with him and millions were watching. Then, at the water's edge, he bent down and lifted a crust of salt from the mud. Under British rule, Indians were forbidden to freely collect or sell the salt left behind by their own sea. The colonial government controlled its production and taxed its sale, forcing people to pay for a mineral their bodies required to remain alive. That small gesture broke the law. It also exposed the law. Police arrested protesters. Crowds raided salt works. Men and women were beaten for approaching piles of crystallized seawater. The empire had expected resistance to look like rebellion. Instead, it looked like an old man holding a handful of mud, and everyone understood the accusation without needing it explained. The British were not merely taxing trade. They had placed a price on survival itself. Today, salt sits in a shaker on your table. It comes in paper packets, plastic tubs, restaurant bowls, and industrial sacks. It is so cheap that people spill it and do not bother to recover it. A kilogram can cost less than a cup of coffee, and the idea that states once built offices, patrols, prisons, roads, and entire revenue systems around this white mineral now seems absurd. But for most of human history, salt was not decoration for food. It was infrastructure. The human body is, in a literal sense, a carefully regulated saltwater system. Sodium helps nerves transmit signals. It allows muscles to contract. It helps maintain the balance of fluid inside and outside cells. Too little can produce weakness, confusion, spasms, and eventually collapse. Ancient people did not know the chemistry, but they knew the physical warning. They felt it after long marches, heavy labor, illness, and days of sweating beneath the sun. They also watched animals. Deer returned to the same exposed ground. Herds followed mineral trails. Elephants entered caves and scraped deposits from stone. Long before people understood sodium, they understood pursuit. Something in the earth could restore strength, and living creatures would travel extraordinary distances to find it. Salt entered human history not as a luxury, but as a need the body could not negotiate with. The earliest sources were not neat white crystals in shops. They were briny springs, dried lake beds, sea marshes, mineral caves, and patches of soil visited by animals. People learned to collect saline water and boil it in clay vessels. They burned salty plants and gathered the mineral-rich ash. Along hot coastlines, they trapped seawater in shallow ponds and waited for the sun to remove everything except the crystals. These methods were slow, local, and dependent on geography. A community living beside a salt spring possessed an advantage that another community might have to walk days to reach. That difference mattered because agriculture quietly changed the human need for salt. Hunters consumed sodium naturally through animal tissue and blood. Farming populations increasingly depended on grains and plants, making separate salt sources more important. As settlements grew, the need became collective. A household could search for salt. A village had to secure it. A city had to organize its supply. That was the first escalation. The mineral had not changed, but human society had. Once thousands of people depended on the same source, salt stopped being something gathered from nature and became something that had to be produced, transported, guarded, and measured. Survival had created logistics, and logistics were already beginning to create power. Yet the transformation that made salt truly revolutionary was not its discovery. It was preservation. In a world without refrigeration, abundance could become waste within days. A successful hunt in summer meant little if the meat spoiled before winter. A river thick with fish could feed a settlement briefly and then leave it hungry again. Salt changed the calendar. Packed around meat or rubbed into fish, it drew out moisture and made conditions less hospitable to many organisms that caused decay. Combined with drying, smoking, fermentation, and careful storage, it extended the life of food from days to weeks, months, or longer. Suddenly, A surplus could travel through time. A family could save part of a slaughter. A fishing community could trade its catch far inland. A ship could remain at sea beyond the point when fresh provisions would have failed. A ruler could collect food in one season and distribute it in another. Salt did not eliminate famine, but it changed what preparation meant. It turned preservation into a technology of planning. It allowed communities to survive winter, armies to move farther from home, and cities to depend on food produced beyond their walls. This is where salt began to shape civilization in a practical way. It did not build monuments. It made the people who built them easier to feed. It did not conquer territory. It preserved the rations carried by those who did. Salt preserved food, but what it really preserved was distance, labor, and time. And once rulers understood that, the mineral became too useful to remain merely local. Roads began to follow salt, and states began to follow the roads. Near Rome, an ancient route later known as the Via Salaria connected inland communities with salt-producing areas near the coast. Salt moved towards settlements. Livestock, goods, soldiers, and taxes moved along the same path. Across the Sahara, slabs of salt traveled south from desert mines toward markets where the mineral was scarce and valuable, while gold and other goods moved north. In West Africa, control of trade corridors helped enrich powerful kingdoms and cities. Salt could be heavy, fragile, and difficult to transport, but that difficulty increased its value far from the source. One famous story claims Roman soldiers were paid directly in salt, and that the word salary comes from a salt ration called a salarium. The connection between the words is real, but the neat image of legionaries receiving blocks of salt as wages is probably too simple. The exact origin is debated, and the popular version survives because it feels true. Armies needed salt, states supplied it, and military power depended on preserved food. The myth exaggerates the payment, but it reveals the system. Salt linked bodies to roads, roads to armies, and armies to revenue. A solution had become valuable. Value attracted power. Power began building rules. By the way, if you have made it this far, you probably already see the pattern. This channel is not really about ordinary objects, it is about the systems hiding inside them. So if that kind of history interests you, subscribe. Now back to the dangerous part. Useful things have a dangerous destiny. Eventually, someone tries to own them. Chinese rulers recognized the potential of salt taxation and monopoly very early. Over different periods, governments restricted private production, licensed merchants, fixed prices, and placed officials between the salt source and the people who needed it. The system was never identical across every dynasty, but the principle endured. Tax the thing no household can completely avoid. Salt revenue helped support armies, administration, transport, and state projects. It also created smugglers, corrupt officials, forged permits, secret workshops, and communities willing to risk punishment for cheaper access. A monopoly transforms a natural need into a gate. On one side stands the population. On the other stands the resource. Between them stands the state, charging for passage. The brilliance of the arrangement was also its cruelty. A luxury tax reaches those who choose the luxury. A salt tax reaches almost everyone. The body itself becomes the enforcement mechanism. Hunger and weakness do what soldiers cannot. They make refusal temporary. France built one of the most hated versions of this system. The gabelle was not a single simple tax applied evenly across the kingdom. It became a maze of regional rules, unequal prices, compulsory purchases, privileged territories, and armed enforcement. In some areas, households were required to buy a fixed amount of official salt from state warehouses, often at prices far above those in neighboring regions. People old enough to be counted by the system could be assigned a legal quantity, whether their family wanted it or could comfortably afford it. The salt was intended for ordinary domestic use, while preserving meat could require additional purchases. Cross a regional boundary, and the same substance might suddenly cost a fraction of the price. Geography had become criminal opportunity. A farmer could stand on one side of a line, look toward cheaper salt on the other, and understand exactly how artificial the shortage was. Smugglers carried loads through forests, hid salt beneath clothing, moved it in carts, or relied on networks of villages that knew the patrol routes. Enforcement agents searched homes and travelers. Thousands were detained, fined, imprisoned, or sent to forced labor over a mineral that existed naturally in sea and soil. The gabelle did more than collect money. It trained ordinary people to experience the monarchy as an intruder in the kitchen. Long before revolution erupted in 1789, salt had already taught them a political lesson. Law could make necessity expensive, inequality could be mapped by province, and the state could call resistance a crime even when the crime was simply buying the same mineral somewhere else. What taxes on necessity always create, eventually, are people who decide that compliance costs more than defiance. Salt smuggling became a profession, a shadow economy, and sometimes a form of resistance without any grand ideology behind it. Most smugglers were not philosophers. They recognized that the salt in an illegal sack and the salt in a royal warehouse were chemically identical, while the price was not. The law did not protect the substance, it protected the markup. That logic reappeared under British rule in India. Colonial control over salt was not the largest source of imperial revenue by 1930, but it was one of the clearest symbols of how foreign rule entered daily life. Indians living beside an immense coastline could not legally treat its salt as freely theirs. Gandhi chose the issue because it crossed class, region, and religion. Rich or poor, Hindu or Muslim, urban or rural, everyone understood salt. The march to Dandi was therefore not a protest about a minor household expense. It was a demonstration of how authority is made visible. Gandhi broke the law in a way ordinary people could repeat. They evaporated seawater, collected natural deposits, sold untaxed salt, and approached government salt works. The response exposed the structure more powerfully than any speech could. An empire claimed legitimacy, yet needed police violence to stop people from touching crystals left by the sea. Salt had become the perfect political weapon, precisely because it was not a weapon. It was ordinary enough to unite millions and essential enough to make the injustice impossible to hide. Then industry changed the balance. Mechanized mining, improved drilling, large evaporation works, railways, steamships, and later modern global logistics expanded production and lowered transport costs. Deposits that had once been difficult to reach could be extracted at enormous scale. Brine could be pumped, processed, purified, and shipped in quantities ancient monopolies could never have imagined. Salt did not cease to matter. It became abundant enough that controlling small household purchases was less profitable and harder to justify. Many old monopolies and taxes disappeared or weakened under political change, industrial supply, and public resistance. The mineral moved from guarded warehouses to grocery shelves, from a strategic treasure to a cheap bulk commodity. But its disappearance from politics was partly an illusion. Most salt is not consumed from table shakers. It moves through chemical plants, food factories, water systems, livestock operations, paper production, textiles, glassmaking, and road maintenance. It helps produce chlorine and caustic soda, chemicals embedded in modern sanitation and manufacturing. It melts ice on highways and stabilizes industrial processes. In food, it preserves, textures, binds, ferments, and intensifies flavor. The old empires saw salt mainly as something bodies needed. Modern industry sees it as a raw material that systems need. The scale grew larger while the object became less visible. And that invisibility is the final reversal. Salt is still in your blood. It is still required by nerves, muscles, farms, kitchens, factories, hospitals, roads, and water treatment plants. The need never disappeared. What disappeared was the sense that salt itself could be used to rule people. It became too common, too cheap, and too widely produced to support the old walls. Governments did not necessarily become more generous. Industry simply made this particular gate difficult to defend. Salt lost much of its political force, not because humanity decided survival should never be taxed, but because power moved toward necessities that were easier to meter, license, patent, finance, restrict, or place behind infrastructure. The ancient pattern remained. Need creates a solution. The solution becomes a tool. The tool becomes valuable. Value attracts power, power builds a system, and eventually the system feels natural. Salt lets us see that pattern because its old machinery has rusted away. We can look back at royal warehouses, colonial laws, compulsory purchases, and armed patrols and recognize the absurdity immediately. The harder question is which ordinary systems around us will look just as absurd to people in the future. Salt did not become less essential. It simply became too abundant to weaponize in the same way. The strange part is not that governments once tried to own it. The strange part is how quickly we forget that every invisible system began when someone noticed a need and decided to stand between it and everyone else. Subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which ordinary object or system you want history to make strange again.